In 1700, India was one of the wealthiest regions on Earth, accounting for nearly 25% of the entire global economy. Indian textiles were prized worldwide. Its artisans produced goods no European could match, and gold and jewels flowed from its territories in quantities that made it the envy of empires. By 1947, when Britain finally left after 2 centuries of colonial rule, India's share of the world economy had collapsed to under 4%. This wasn't natural economic evolution or the result of fair competition, it was systematic extraction on a scale never seen before in human history. Some economic estimates put the total wealth drained from India to Britain at the equivalent of $45 trillion in today's money. This is the story of how the British Empire built its industrial might, its global dominance, and its legendary wealth, not through innovation or fair trade, but through the organized looting of an entire subcontinent. The Sabio Observer recognizes this as the blueprint for modern wealth extraction. The same mechanisms that colonial powers used to drain colonies are the same mechanisms that the financial elite use today, through debt systems, structural adjustment, and trade policies that favor developed nations over developing ones. The British didn't just take India's wealth, they restructured India's entire economy to serve British interests, converting a sophisticated manufacturing economy into a captive market for British goods and a supplier of raw materials for British factories. They used military force initially, but the real control came through economic mechanisms, taxation systems that drained revenue, trade policies that destroyed local industries, infrastructure built to extract resources rather than develop the nation, and debt obligations that kept India perpetually indebted to its colonizers. And the most insidious part was making Indians pay for their own exploitation. Indian taxes funded the British military occupation of India. Indian labor built the railways that carried Indian resources to British ships. Indian farmers grew crops for export, while millions starved in famines caused by policies that prioritized British profits over Indian lives. This wasn't just theft, it was a complete economic restructuring designed to transfer wealth from the many to the few, from the colony to the empire, from the producers to the financial elite who controlled trade. Stick with me, and I'll expose exactly how Britain accomplished this extraction, why the mechanisms they used became the model for modern economic exploitation, and what this reveals about how wealth concentration always works through controlling systems rather than producing value. Ready to see the original debt trap that inspired all others? Let's examine how an empire built its prosperity on systematic plunder. Let's start with what India was before British conquest, because understanding the starting point reveals the scale of destruction that colonial rule achieved. In 1700, India's economy was a manufacturing powerhouse. The Mughal Empire controlled a sophisticated system of production and trade. Indian textiles, muslins, calicos, silks were the finest in the world, exported across Europe, Asia, and Africa. Indian steel was superior to anything produced in Europe. Indian craftsmen created luxury goods that European nobles competed to purchase. Agriculture was productive and diverse, feeding a massive population while generating surpluses for trade. India's share of world GDP, at roughly 23 to 25%, exceeded that of all of Europe combined. This was genuine wealth based on production, skill, and trade. But everything changed after the Battle of Plassey in 1757, when the British East India Company defeated the Nawab of Bengal through a combination of military force and bribery of local officials. This wasn't a national conquest initially, it was a corporate takeover. The East India Company, a private corporation, secured the right to collect taxes in Bengal, one of India's richest provinces. From that moment, India's economic transformation began. The company didn't want India to remain a manufacturing competitor. They wanted it to serve British industrial needs. So they systematically destroyed India's textile industry through punitive taxation and tariffs that made Indian cloth uncompetitive in its own markets while flooding those markets with cheaper British textiles produced in mechanized factories. The mechanism of destruction was elegant in its cruelty. Indian weavers were taxed heavily on their production, making their goods expensive. British textiles entered India duty-free or with minimal tariffs, making them cheaper despite being imported from thousands of miles away. Indian textiles exported to Britain faced tariffs of 70–80%, making them unaffordable in European markets. The result was inevitable. India's textile industry, which had employed millions and generated massive wealth, collapsed. Weavers starved or were forced into agriculture. Manufacturing towns became ghost towns. Within decades, India transformed from a major exporter of finished goods to an importer of British manufactured products and an exporter of raw materials, raw cotton to feed British mills, indigo and opium for British trade networks, wheat and rice to feed British populations. The cost of living in India rose as local production was destroyed, while Britain's economy boomed from access to cheap raw materials and captive markets. This was the drain of wealth, systematic transfer of economic value from India to Britain through policies designed to benefit the colonizer at the expense of the colonized. And this was just the beginning of the extraction system. Now let's examine how British colonial infrastructure was specifically designed to extract rather than develop. Because the railways, ports, and administrative systems that Britain built in India are often cited as colonial benefits, but the reality reveals them as tools of systematic plunder. The British built extensive railway networks across India, over 40,000 miles of track by independence. Historians and apologists for colonialism point to this as evidence of British investment in India's development. But look at how those railways were financed and what purpose they served. Indian taxes paid for the construction, but British investors received guaranteed returns of 5% or more on their railway investments, regardless of whether the railways were profitable. This meant Indian taxpayers subsidized British profits while assuming all the risk, and examine where those railways went and what they carried. The rail networks weren't designed to connect Indian cities for internal trade and development, they were designed to connect resource extraction points to ports. Railways carried raw cotton from inland India to Bombay for export to British mills. They transported wheat and rice to ports during famines, while millions of Indians starved because the food was exported to fetch higher prices in Britain. They carried opium to ports for export to China, as part of Britain's drug trade that funded the empire. The railways served extraction, not development. Meanwhile, India's traditional road networks, which had facilitated internal trade for centuries, were neglected and fell into disrepair because they didn't serve British commercial interests. The same pattern applied to all colonial infrastructure. Irrigation systems were built to support cash crops for export rather than food for local consumption. Ports were modernized to handle exports to Britain, not to facilitate Indian trade with other nations. The administrative system was designed to collect taxes efficiently and suppress dissent, not to govern for the benefit of the governed. And all of this was paid for by Indian taxes, while Britain extracted the benefits. The numbers are staggering. From 1765 to 1938, Britain extracted an estimated $45 trillion from India in today's currency, through various mechanisms: direct taxation, trade manipulation, repatriation of profits, and the structural forcing of India into economic subservience. This wasn't wealth earned through trade. It was wealth stolen through a system designed to transfer resources from producers to colonizers. The financial elite in London didn't build their wealth through innovation. They built it through controlling the system that extracted India's wealth and channeled it to Britain, and the mechanisms they perfected in India became the model for economic exploitation globally. The same structural adjustment policies, the same debt traps, the same trade arrangements that favor powerful nations over weaker ones are direct descendants of colonial economic policies that proved so profitable for empires. Let's confront the enduring consequences and what they reveal about how wealth extraction always operates through system design rather than fair competition. When Britain finally left India in 1947, after 2 centuries of extraction, India wasn't just poor, it had been structurally underdeveloped. Its manufacturing capacity had been destroyed. Its agriculture had been warped to serve export markets rather than feed its population. Its infrastructure was designed for extraction, not development, and it inherited a bureaucratic system designed for control, not governance. The partition that accompanied independence was itself partially a result of British divide-and-rule policies that had deliberately fostered religious tensions to prevent unified resistance to colonial rule. The human cost was catastrophic. Estimates suggest that British policies, particularly during famines that were caused or worsened by prioritizing exports over feeding the population, led to tens of millions of Indian deaths. But understanding this history isn't just about assigning blame or cataloging atrocities, it's about recognizing the patterns that continue today in more sophisticated forms. The same economic mechanisms that Britain used to drain India are now embedded in global financial institutions and trade agreements. The International Monetary Fund and World Bank impose structural adjustment policies on indebted nations that force them to privatize public assets, open markets to foreign competition, cut social spending, and prioritize debt repayment, exactly the same pattern of forcing economic reorganization to benefit foreign capital that Britain imposed on India. The global trade system is still rigged to favor wealthy nations. Developed countries maintain agricultural subsidies and tariffs, while demanding that developing nations eliminate protections for their industries, recreating the asymmetry that destroyed India's textile industry. And the debt trap is the modern version of colonial taxation. Instead of directly occupying nations, the financial elite lends them money through international institutions, then uses debt servicing obligations to control economic policy and extract wealth through interest payments that must be paid in hard currency earned through exports. The borrowing nation must export raw materials and commodities to earn dollars or euros to service debt, while importing manufactured goods from the lending nations, maintaining the same core periphery relationship that colonialism established. The wealth gap between former colonial powers and former colonies isn't accidental. It was deliberately created through centuries of systematic extraction and is maintained through international financial structures that continue the same transfer of wealth from periphery to core. Britain's prosperity wasn't built on innovation or hard work. It was built on India's stolen wealth, and that stolen wealth became the capital that funded Britain's industrial revolution, its global financial dominance, and the prosperity that British citizens enjoy today. The cost of living in India remains low, partly because its economy was deliberately underdeveloped to serve Britain. The economic system that governs the modern world was designed by colonial powers to benefit themselves. And despite political independence, the structural relationships remain largely intact. This is why understanding colonial economic history matters. It reveals that poverty and wealth aren't natural states, but results of designed systems, and those systems are still operating today. So there's the complete story. India went from 25% of the global economy to under 4%, not through fair competition, but through systematic extraction by Britain that involved destroying Indian manufacturing, restructuring agriculture to serve British markets, building infrastructure for extraction, and draining an estimated $45 trillion over 2 centuries. The British Empire's wealth wasn't earned through superior economic management. It was stolen through controlling the system and forcing India to pay for its own exploitation. And the mechanisms perfected in colonial India became the blueprint for modern economic extraction through debt, structural adjustment, and trade policies that maintain the same basic pattern of wealth transfer from periphery to core. The question you need to answer is, if colonial extraction on this scale built British prosperity while devastating India, and if the same basic mechanisms continue today through international financial institutions and trade agreements, what does that tell you about the global economy's fundamental structure? The debt crisis affecting developing nations isn't accidental. It's the continuation of colonial extraction through financial rather than political control. The wealth gap between nations isn't natural. It's the result of centuries of designed extraction. And the financial elite who profit from this system are the descendants, literally and figuratively, of those who profited from colonial plunder. Here's what I need you to do. Research whether your country has a colonial history, either as colonizer or colonized. If it was colonized, examine whether its current economic structure still reflects the extractive patterns imposed during colonial rule: raw material exports, import dependence for manufactured goods, debt to former colonial powers or their institutions. If your country was a colonizer, examine whether its current wealth and economic position were built on colonial extraction. Understanding this history isn't about guilt or resentment. It's about seeing how the economic system was designed and recognizing that it wasn't designed for fairness. And if this video exposed how the British Empire built prosperity on India's systematic impoverishment through economic mechanisms that continue today in modified forms, subscribe to this channel right now, because understanding colonial economic history reveals that the modern debt system, trade policies, and wealth concentration aren't recent developments, but the continuation of patterns established centuries ago. The empire never really ended. It just became financial rather than political. The extraction continues. Only the mechanisms have been refined.